Good evening. Before we get started, I wanted to make sure that you had a chance to sign in at either of these doors and that there were two sets of handouts. One is a packet of general information and the other is the slide presentation with an area that you can write some notes. So we'll give it a couple more minutes as people are still coming in, but we'll get started in just a bit. Do I happen to have any parents of juniors in here? Okay. We'll talk about this towards the end, but some of the information with the FAFSA will be changing for next year. So it will look a little bit different when any of the junior parents go to do it. And you all too, when you do it for your returning college student. All right, good evening, everybody. As people are still trickling in, I'll just sort of start with an introduction of myself and the organization that I work for. So my name is Mrs. Christine Jankowski, and I work for an organization called LEAF, and we're contracted by the school district to meet with particularly seniors, and later in the year we meet with junior students, and also to be there available to you as the family, to work as a financial helping hand to the guidance department. So I would like to thank the administrators and the guidance staff for hosting myself and our LEAF organization here today. So a little bit about myself and why I'm standing here in front of you is that I've been in your shoes. So I have 3 children in their 20s, all very different children. So 3 children, 4 different schools, one of them transferred. I've been on well over about 25 college visits. Some of them were duplicates. But as my own children went through the process, I became more and more interested in this particular area. And I know that before I had this particular job, I made some mistakes. And I thought with some of the knowledge that I gained along the way just from personal experience and through my training with LEAF, hopefully, and with this presentation, that I can help you avoid maybe a couple mistakes too. So I have to be honest, some mistakes I made is I literally left some money on the table. And I hate when that happens. So by doing this, I'm hoping that you don't make those same mistakes that I did. So LEAF, we're a nonprofit organization, and we started out in Lake and Geauga counties, but now have expanded into more than 20 high schools in eastern Cuyahoga, Summit County, and now Portage. As I mentioned, we're in Lake and Geauga as well. So we're in a variety of different schools. I myself work at 3 different school districts. So we work part-time essentially, and we provide free services to your students and you also. So my contact information is on this first slide with my email. That is one of the best ways to reach me. But since I do go to a couple different school districts, when I'm at Mentor, I concentrate fully on Mentor students and their families, and when I'm at my other school districts, I'm doing the same there. So if you email me, just know that I will get back to you, but it may take a day or two depending on my schedule and where I'm at. I also have a partner here at Mentor, which is a wonderful thing. She's been here many, many years and is very, very knowledgeable about the whole financial aid process and Mentor High School in general, and her name is Mrs. Jane Cesar. So we job share. If you're reaching out, feel free to email both of us on an email, so depending on the day of the week, one or the other of us will get back to you, and the same holds true if your child is reaching out. We also do have Mentor Schools email. Either way would be fine to reach us. We are here at Mentor Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays during the school day. We're available for individualized appointments with yourself, and then our goal is to see as many seniors as we can. So there are 600 some seniors. Realistically, we're not able to get to all of them, but I have gone into, myself and Mrs. Cesar, into the English classes to introduce ourselves, let the students know about our services, and how to contact us by email or with sign-ups so that if they would like to see us sooner rather than later, that they can do so. And going through this presentation, you might see instances where you would want your student to meet with me, and then I would encourage you to have them reach out to us. A little bit about when they do meet with us is that we have written material that we provide them, and it's very valuable information. It applies throughout the school year and throughout the post-secondary education financial aid process. So what they get when they come to meet with us is a very much scaled down version of this presentation, but I think it's very, very important that your student is aware of what goes into the financial aid process, that they're knowledgeable about what loans are, et cetera. So we cover these topics in our visits with them. We only meet with them once, but then after that time, if they want to reach out again, we will gladly give priority to them, and they can reach out whenever they need to for subsequent visits. So we have certain students that are meeting us all throughout the year as we go through the timeline, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So if you're here for financial aid, you are in the correct place. So today's agenda is we're going to define financial aid, the different types, their sources, how colleges award it. We'll talk about the financial aid process, what to do if a family situation has recently changed, and touch on how you can find scholarships. You'll hear a lot of different initials like Fsa Id, the Fafsa, and Css Profile, but no worries, we'll break that down. It's a lot of information to unpack. So again, throughout the year, I'll help you through it. So the Department of Education's philosophy is that a student and a student's family has the primary responsibility for paying for college. Financial aid is money provided to students to help pay for college. And aid can come from the federal government, the state government, the institution itself, and private sources. But loans are considered financial aid. So sometimes you'll hear other parents say, oh, I didn't get anything, I didn't qualify, but with the FAFSA, loans are considered financial aid, and everyone is eligible to get government loans for their student. So we have two types of aid. Gift aid is great money. That's the kind we really, really want. The self-help aid is good money. Let's focus on that gift aid. So that's exactly what it means. It's a gift to you. That money does not need to be repaid. So that would be in the form of scholarship and grant money. And that could come from the college itself, federal and state grants, and also private sources. Self-help aid are loans. Loans have to be repaid. Work-study would be an area where this is a question on the FAFSA, which we'll get into a little bit later. But work-study would be a situation where, based on need, that student would be able to apply for particular jobs that are considered work-study jobs. They typically work 20 hours or less a week for minimum wage, and they actually earn a paycheck, and then that would go towards helping probably to pay their tuition costs. So this is a question on the FAFSA. If you're not sure if your student would be interested in work-study, or even if you would qualify, I would say you're interested in it or not sure versus a flat no. But with this, they need to find the job, get the job, and show up to the job. So the financial aid process itself, we're going to see how that is all awarded to your student. So I've alluded to something called the FAFSA a couple times already. That's a free application for federal student aid. And it's the one form that all students should really complete regardless of where they're applying. And the reason behind that is the FAFSA is the form that all colleges need in order to consider a student for any federal and state grant money or federal student and parent loans. Most colleges also use the FAFSA to award their own institutional aid. So in many cases, the FAFSA is the only form that a student would need to file. There are some exceptions to this, and that would be colleges or universities that would need what's called a Css Profile. That tends to be with institutions that are trying to meet the financial needs of their students. This is an extra form that's in addition to the FAFSA. It is like the FAFSA on steroids, a little bit more in depth. Takes a little bit longer to complete. But your student should look at the websites of the colleges that they're applying for and see if a CSS profile is needed. There might be some schools that might have institutional forms that are specific to them. So they want to explore those. We'll talk a little bit more about those coming up. So there's 3 steps in the application process that we'll be going into in more detail on the subsequent slides. So as we're going through this, especially since the lights are dimmed, I just wanted to mention, I will allow time for questions at the end for general questions, and then afterwards, if you have something that's a specific situation, I'll take those up here on a little bit more individual basis. The first step is establishing an Fsa Id, which we'll get into. Completing the FAFSA, and I do want to mention that if you have already completed a FAFSA for your senior student, then you have done the incorrect year. I have seen that mistake be made, so I just wanted to throw that out there, that if you finished a FAFSA for your current senior, then that is not the correct year for when they will be starting school. So this Fsa Id, what that is you go to the website studentaid.gov/FSA-ID to create an ID for one parent and the student themselves. A parent needs an ID and the student. The student should be the one creating their ID. This is a great way to get them involved in the process. So they're aware of what's going on. And they have challenge questions, etc., that it is best if the student is the one creating that particular account. This Fsa Id is used to sign the federal document. So after you complete the FAFSA, the parent signs and the student signs that document. Each ID requires a unique email address, so email addresses can't be shared. A student should not use their mentor high school address because that will disappear. And on the other side of that too, as the parent, you do not want to use your work address because, again, that's something that could change. It should be an email that you use regularly and that's your personal email. To create this Fsa Id, you'll need to have your social security number, and it takes about 15 minutes. This is something that could be even done after tonight's talk, for example, to create this ID. Once you do this 15-minute process, then the Social Security Administration is going to verify that the Social Security number, everything is all good, and you'll get an email 1 to 3 business days later to say that everything is A-OK. You want to make sure you keep this information in a safe and secure place. There is a way to recover that information, but it's, can be a little bit of a pain. Sometimes students keep this information in their phones, but if their phone is lost or stolen, then that's not always the best thing. So if you have another secure location. If you do happen to have twins, you don't need, as a parent, 2 separate IDs. If you have twins or triplets or whatever, you just need your own Fsa Id. But each of the twins or the triplets as the student would need their own IDs. Okay. It is used, as I mentioned, to electronically sign after the FAFSA is done. It accesses federal student aid websites, including that online FAFSA application. It allows you to make corrections to the FAFSA online and to track student loans until they're paid off. So you can have this Fsa Id if it's for a student for well over 10 years. The FAFSA is something that needs to be done annually to maintain eligibility for loans, for example. Okay, completing the FAFSA. As I mentioned, the FAFSA is free online application by the U.S. Department of Education. And what it does is it collects family financial information to calculate an index number, something called an EFC. And colleges use that EFC to determine financial need and award aid. So for your senior students, you will be completing the 23-24 FAFSA on or after October 1st, which is coming up. And you'll be using 2021 income tax information and W-2 forms, as well as current asset values. We'll be talking more about all those, that information that you'll need. Before you go to sit down to complete the FAFSA, you should have a good idea of schools that your student is applying to. The FAFSA will take up to 10 colleges. And again, when I say college, I'm talking about 2-year schools, 4-year schools, trade schools. Trade schools also can require that the FAFSA be done. And there's codes that will be listed for each particular school that pops up. It's a very search, no need to worry about that. In general, you want to make sure that your student knows when their deadline is for FAFSA filing for their particular college or university. So in the packet that we provided on the very last page, there's listing of schools in Ohio and their FAFSA priority deadlines. As I mentioned before, you want to make sure this FAFSA is done every year to maintain eligibility for loans. This is an example of what the site looks like. So studentaid.gov is where you're going to go to complete the FAFSA form, and there's a tab there to apply for aid. You're going to use your laptop, or if you do use a phone, you could go into a browser such as Chrome or Google to complete it. Last year they did have an app on the phone, but very percentage-wise it wasn't used that much, so that was discontinued. So an app is no longer an option. So the best way is to use your computer or laptop. You have the option to log in as the student or as the parent. For the student, it's quick and easy just with the Fsa Id. If you're logging in as the parent, you'll need a few more steps. You'll need the student identifiers, which include the student's name, social security number, and date of birth. Believe it or not, I've had some parents, when they went to do this, would put in the wrong birth date. They might think of the sibling. So you want to just make sure you're very accurate with that social security number, etc. Okay, there is a ton of information on this particular slide, and we're going to walk through it step by step. With the FAFSA, the big question is, who is the parent on the FAFSA? And this is a very common area where we, as LEAF staff, get a lot of questions. A student needs parent information up until they turn 24. There are some criteria in which that is not needed, but those are pretty rare instances. For FAFSA purposes, a parent is a biological or adoptive parent. So grandparents, foster parents, legal guardians, older siblings, other relatives are not considered parents for FAFSA purposes unless they've adopted the student. So we'll talk through this graphic. So the first one is, are the student's parents married? If the answer is yes, then only one of the parents needs to get an Fsa Id. And as I mentioned before, the student needs to get their ID, and the financial information for both parents is needed. If the parents aren't married, but they happen to be living together, it's the same scenario according to the FAFSA. One parent would need to have an Fsa Id, so it could be either parent. Both parents' financial information would be needed on the FAFSA. And that is even if they're divorced, separated, or never married. So again, if they happen to be living together, that would be the scenario in that case. And they're looking at this information as of the date that the FAFSA is filed. If parents are not married or living together, then the question is, who does the student live with more than 50% of the time? This is the big criteria. And whoever that parent is the one that would complete the FAFSA for that student. They would need to have an ID. And if that parent happens to be remarried, the spouse's information is included on the FAFSA. So many people will ask, how do you really know if it's 50-50? So if it sways one way or another, you think there's 365 days in a year. If maybe vacation swings it to one parent versus another, or with weekends or whatnot, you go with the person that the student lives with more than 50% of the time. If it is exactly 50-50, then you go with the parent that provides greater financial support to the student. So at this point, it doesn't matter who claims that student on their taxes. For FAFSA purposes, for the 23-24 FAFSA year, it's again who that student lives with more than 50% of the time, or if it's exactly 50-50, who provides greater financial support. And again, if that particular parent is remarried, they require the spouse's information also. Non-citizen parents are still required to include the information on the student's FAFSA, but they use a signature page rather than an Fsa Id. The other question we get a lot is, as a parent then, am I liable for college costs? The answer is no. Just because you're providing your financial information on the FAFSA does not mean that you need to pay for your student's college education. The two are really not related. So next we're going to get into the information needed to complete the FAFSA. As I mentioned earlier, you need 2021 W-2 forms, 1040 forms, and any non-retirement asset account balances, such as stocks, bonds, mutual funds, rental property net values, savings and checking account, and the total of 529 plan balances for all parent-held 529 accounts. Even if the student who you're doing the FAFSA for does not have a 529, but if your other children do, you need to include those 529 amounts as a parental asset. Untaxed income, such as child support paid or received, disability and contributions to retirement in 2021 are also included. So again, that's contributions to retirement in 2021. There's a question that relates to that on a FAFSA, and you're referring to your W-2 to get that answer. The asset value are as of the date where you go and are doing the FAFSA. And you want to have a pretty good idea of what those values are, just in case you would happen to be selected for verification purposes. So it doesn't have to be exact, but if you have your bank account statements or a pretty good idea of the, as of that date, you want to be fairly close to the values. So what items are excluded? Where you live, the value of your primary residence and your vehicles, Social Security income, Social Security disability, and your general retirement funds. Okay, so your overall 401ks, IRAs, that balance that you might have there is not included in the FAFSA. People get that confused a lot, so that's an important point. And if you have a business but it has fewer than 100 full-time employees, you can exclude that from the FAFSA. As you're completing the FAFSA, you may have the ability to use something called an IRS data retrieval tool. It allows students and parents who have filed the tax return with the IRS to access that information and have it directly transferred onto the FAFSA form. And what's nice is it saves a few steps in the FAFSA, and it will say on the FAFSA that it was transferred from the IRS, but without the monetary values listed there. An Fsa Id is required to use this system. And this allows security feature, so as I mentioned before, you don't see that tax information dollar amount once it's transferred. If you have questions about what's transferred, you'll have to contact the financial aid administrator at the college once the FAFSA has been processed, if you have any questions about that. Okay, so the IRS data retrieval tool can be used by dependent students and their parents if they did their taxes married filing jointly or as head of household. Then you're eligible to do the data retrieval tool. But parents who are married but filed separately are not eligible to use this tool and would need to manually enter tax information. So there are a few things that happen once a FAFSA is filed. And this is my big reminder, your student is part of this process. They should really, starting now, get in the habit of frequently checking their emails. It is very important. So when I see a student, I'll tell them to check their email, check their email, check their email. After the FAFSA is filed, they're going to get a link to what's called a Student Aid Report, or SAR, and it is sent to their email about 3 to 10 days after submitting the FAFSA form. They want to read that form to make sure that there aren't any errors on the FAFSA, because if there are, they can make corrections to the FAFSA by logging back in with their Fsa Id. Another possibility that might occur after the FAFSA is filed is your student might be selected for something called verification. What that is additional paperwork might be required by each school that they apply to, and they would get detailed information about what that is. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. Financial aid award letters are sent to students once the school has accepted the student and they've received their FAFSA. Many colleges post their financial aid award letters December through April. If you have any questions about the financial aid award letters, you would want to contact their particular college. The financial aid award letter, to me, is really the meat and potatoes of everything. This is where you're going to find out what your out-of-pocket costs are. It will detail the entire award for the student and could include any grants, scholarships, the loan amounts, and work study they might be eligible for. They will need to follow the directions to accept their awards by the deadlines given, and May 1st is decision day. That is the deadline to commit to colleges, where typically they'll require a housing deposit. Then in July or August, the bills will be generated, and typically about mid-August, the first semester's payment is due. Prior to that, around graduation time, there's also a few other steps the student needs to do, and that if they're taking out loans, they'll do loan entrance counseling and a master promissory note. So again, around June graduation time would be the time to take care of those steps. So as I mentioned earlier, verification is a process that the schools might follow to confirm accuracy of your information. This is a double check process. About 20% of FAFSAs that are filed are selected for verification. If you're chosen for this, it doesn't mean that you did anything wrong, so no worries about that. And it would show up on your student aid report if verification is needed for the student. This involves additional forms and to verify income information, such as providing copies of tax documents if that IRS data retrieval tool wasn't used during the FAFSA filing. It's really important that you follow the school's directions carefully. Feel free to reach out to us as LEAF advisors if you need help with this, or to the college's financial aid office if you have any question. Failing to complete this process could cause the student to be ineligible for aid. And about 25% of students selected for verification never complete the process, and that can keep a student from attending college. So that's why, it's very important for your student to check to make sure that they have not been selected for verification. Okay, there are situations where maybe a family's financial situation has changed since 2021, which is going to be your base year for your students' 23-24 FAFSA. And this is for a decrease in income only. You're able to have a college's financial aid office review your situation. Some possible reasons for a petition would be a loss of a job, reduction of overtime or income, large medical bills not covered by insurance, situation of divorce or separation, tuition paid to a private elementary or secondary school for siblings. What is not considered for an appeal would be any credit card bills, mortgage payments, co-pays for checkups, or parent student loan payments. The college would ask for supporting documentation for your situation and evaluate it based on their professional judgment. It would be important in this process to follow all directions carefully and completely, and their financial aid office has the final decision in any appeal. And different colleges may come to different conclusions about how they handle an appeal. So the answer may not be the same at all the colleges. Earlier, I alluded to something called the CSS Profile, or institutional forms. This is for a handful of schools. It's not all schools, but it is a non-federal financial aid form administered through the College Board. It does have fees associated with its application. If a student has certain income, meets certain income criteria, those fees would be waived for that CSS profile. Colleges or universities that might require a CSS profile or their own institutional forms tend to be ones that try to meet a high percentage of financial need and offer large amounts of financial aid. Usually these are private schools, although University of Michigan, which is a public university, does require the CSS profile. So if that happens to be a school on your students' list, you would want to make sure that you plan for that and allow for that extra time to complete that form. In Ohio, 4 schools that you want to be aware of that requires that are Case Western, Denison, Kenyon, and Oberlin. So with that, and institutional forms might be another example of that, depending on the school. Some tips and tricks for financial aid applications. You want to make sure you're meeting priority filing deadlines to maximize your aid. So as I mentioned on that handout on the last sheets would be priority FAFSA deadlines. And it also lists there when you can expect to see financial aid award letters from your various colleges. A college's institutional need is based on financial aid is limited, so that's why those FAFSA priority deadlines are so important. Typically, these dates are around December 1st or later. Again, remind your student to check the financial aid portion of their colleges to see if any additional forms like that CSS profile or any institutional forms are needed. With the FAFSA and the CSS profile, don't feel like you have to finish all of it in one sitting. You can save the information and come back to it later. For CCP students, one question that we get often that can tend to be confusing is what are they considered? So they are considered first time, never attended college. Even though they'll be earning college credits for FAFSA purposes, CCP students, there will be a question there. You would put first time, never attended college. Okay, this is where mistakes might be made. Sometimes parents talk. Again, you might hear, oh, I did the FAFSA, we didn't get anything. We highly encourage families to do the FAFSA, especially the first year. You don't know what kind of aid might come back for a particular school. There might be some grant money or scholarship money that you weren't expecting. It is the only way that you can be able to be eligible for federal student loans is by using the FAFSA. My coworker, her daughter, for example, just by having a FAFSA on file, had received a scholarship to study abroad. So as I mentioned, it can be used for scholarship money too. You really do want this to be a collaborative effort with your child because it's important that they know what's involved in the process. Ultimately, if they're taking out federal loans, it is in their name. So you want them to have some knowledge. That's why when they meet with us in the LEAF office, I go over this information in a condensed version so they know what to expect. Before I had this job, I did talk about loans with my own children, but my daughter said she really didn't understand them fully until she had to start repaying them. So the financial aid timeline. And this is essentially when I'm meeting with students, kind of what I'm covering at different parts of the school year. So you'll be notified of your aid via a financial aid award letter which tends to arrive between December and April. As I mentioned earlier, deposits and decision day is May 1st. Colleges will often encourage students to pay money sooner, but you are not required to do that for general acceptances. So they can tend to rush. Sometimes I have students that are very anxious to pay that amount, and they say, I'm going here, I'm going here, I'm going here. But you want to make sure you have all the information. You want to have all those financial aid award letters. If cost is a factor for your family, and if two schools are equal in the student's eyes, then maybe you would go with the one that has less out-of-pocket costs. Those financial aid letters are so important as to know what you're paying out of pocket. Bills are likely to be sent to the student's online portal, as I mentioned, in July or early August. And loans, you have the ability to accept or decline those federal student loans. And payment is typically in August. So how do colleges award financial aid? So there's two main ways that colleges provide aid, the first of which is merit. Typically what happens with this is once a student applies to that college and they're accepted, they'll get a letter and says, congratulations, you've been accepted, and you've also received this amount in merit aid award. That could be based on GPAs, ACT, SAT test scores, their special talents, athletics, leadership, artistic or musical talents, a variety of things. It could be religious or ethnic background, leadership, or general well-roundedness. This might all fall under the category of merit aid. Then there's financial need, and this is based on this little formula below. So there's something called the cost of attendance, or COA, which really varies from school to school. And it's a combination of costs, direct and indirect costs. The difference being that direct costs are billed by the college. And these include tuition, fees, room and board. Indirect costs tend to be variable, and it would be things such as books, supplies, transportation, personal expenses. But colleges will list an overall cost of attendance. Then when you do the FAFSA, a number has been calculated, this expected family contribution, also known as the EFC, and that remains a constant. Financial need is variable, and that is because it's based on the school's costs. So the college financial aid offices try to fill the need with gift aid and self-help aid, which is loans, which loans again need to be repaid. Some colleges fill need better than others, and it can vary even from year to year what kind of aid they're giving out. At this point in time, I would highly encourage that you don't limit your students' choices. So for example, private schools, they may have a high sticker price tag, but you really don't know what you will need to pay until you get that financial aid award letter. The same holds true for out-of-state schools. They may have a higher sticker price tag being out of state, but maybe they have various grants that would bring those costs down. So we encourage students to create kind of a wide net with colleges, and then the time to make those decisions are once you have all the data in front of you with the financial aid award letters. So I always tell them their job is to explore a variety of options, public and private institutions, and not to rule out private, but maybe not to get their heart set on a particular school until they have all the facts to see whether it's affordable or not. So again, you just don't want to limit choices at this point in time. It's too early. You may need to limit choices once you have all the facts with those financial aid award letters. So the EFC, or expected family contribution, as I mentioned earlier, that's an index number calculated from the information that's provided on the FAFSA, and it's using a federal formula or a federal methodology. It's tied to the amount of some federal and state grants awarded to the student. Although its name can be misleading, it does not indicate what the student will pay for 1 year of college. So they'll give you that number, but that doesn't mean that's exactly what that student will pay. Some things that influence the EFC are income and assets from the parent and the student, family size, number of family members in college, and the age of the older parent. As I mentioned, prior to having this job, I did make some mistakes myself, and one of which was that I had a daughter that did co-op, so we weren't planning on taking out loans that particular year, so I didn't do a FAFSA for her, but I did one for my son, and he got a grant, which grant money, remember, is gift money, and that was because I had 2 in college at the same time. So I literally left money on the table with my daughter because I didn't do the FAFSA that year. So learn from my mistakes. So types of aid that may be awarded to your student. So grant money, we're going to talk through a variety of grants. The Pell grant's an award based on a student's EFC and their enrollment status. It's for undergraduate students, and the EFC has to be less than $6,206 to qualify for that award. And then it has a range of $692 to $6,895. Typically, if a student is eligible for a Pell grant when the FAFSA was completed, it would state that on there. There's also something called an Fseog. It's a form of campus-based gift aid, and this does run out. It's important to meet the deadlines to maximize the possibility of being awarded this grant. It goes to the neediest students on campus and does not exceed $4,000. As I mentioned before, that's $6,206 for the Pell grant. If the EFC is higher than that, no Pell grants awarded. And as I mentioned before, grant money is gift money. It does not need to be repaid. So for example, if someone is eligible for the Pell grant and they go to, say, Lakeland, a good portion of their costs are going to be covered by that Pell grant. There's also something called a Teach grant. This is for education majors who agree to teach in high-need subjects in low-income schools for a period of at least 4 years. They have 8 years after graduation to complete this requirement, and up to $4,000 per year can be awarded. But not all colleges offer this particular program. And this is the caveat with it. If the specific work commitment isn't completed, the grant is converted back into something called an unsubsidized loan, and repayment with interest is required, with that interest accruing from the date of first disbursement. The next grant we'll talk about is a state grant, or the Ohio College Opportunity Grant, or Ocog. And this is a grant awarded to students based on their EFC, their enrollment status, and the type of college. To qualify, a student must have an EFC of $2,190 or less, and a household income less than $96,000. And the current awards are listed on the slide, so as you can see, they vary from nonprofit colleges to proprietary schools with different dollar amounts. Other types of state aid include Ohio War, Orphan, and Severely Disabled Veterans Children's Scholarship, and the various grants that are listed on this slide can be found at www.ohiohighered.org. The Choose Ohio First STEM grant usually requires some additional application and differs in amounts and requirements from school to school. And you'd want to check the school's website or the website that I mentioned, ohiohighered.org, for more information. Scholarships. So when we meet with your students in our LEAF office, we talk about scholarships. And I encourage them to explore scholarships in this particular order. So your biggest source of scholarship money can come from the institution itself. And this can really vary from school to school. And that's why I mentioned earlier about private schools, not necessarily to rule them out. Sometimes they have very strong alumni bases, and they have alumni that strongly support the school with money for scholarship purposes. Institutional aid for the school can be based on merit or need. And many of the colleges have online searches or list of scholarships or aid that could be available to students if they fit the criteria. So it's important once they've sort of narrowed down their choices that they really explore those websites to see what's out there. Once they're at that particular college or university, they continue to look for scholarships for current students, great source of money. And the beauty with institutional scholarships is many times it is renewable if you maintain a certain grade point, for example. The second largest source of scholarship money can be outside scholarships. So here at Mentor High, the scholarships are listed in Schoology, as well as there are physical copies in the guidance office. I highly encourage students to look at scholarship searching sort of as a part-time job. Right now, they should be focusing on their college application process to be sure they're meeting deadlines. But after everything is all in, it's really important that they try to look for this free money, because again, this is gift money. It does not need to be repaid. There's a variety of criteria for scholarships. They're not all based on need or GPAs. It can come from a variety of different sources. Oftentimes there's an essay that might be needed. It's important that they do the application thoroughly and have someone else proofread their application and the essay. It can be time-consuming. There is no doubt about that, which is why some students don't want to have any part of that. But the beauty is, if they spend 10 hours of time applying and they get a $1,000 scholarship, they just made $100 an hour. And they particularly want to look, as I mentioned, for renewable scholarships. It can be a great way to keep those costs of scholarships, cost of college attendance down. The third category is national scholarships. These tend to be higher dollar value amounts, but it is a wider pool of applicants. So I do recommend searching in that particular order: institutional, then the local, and finally the national scholarships. We're going to finish up our presentation talking about the loans that are out there. So if there are loans that are required to help finance a student's education, it's recommended that students take out the maximum in the federal direct loans first. This is an application for the student. It does not require them to have a cosigner, and they are not required to have a credit check. And the beauty of this type of loan is that it's in the student's name only. These loans appear on the financial aid award letter, and there are two types: subsidized, which is need-based, and unsubsidized, which is non-need-based loans. Interest is paid by the government on the subsidized direct loans, but interest accrues on the unsubsidized portion. The student, if they have the unsubsidized loan, can choose to pay the interest while enrolled in school, or they allow it to capitalize onto the loan principal just before repayment begins. The current interest rate is 4.99%, but that rate adjusts every July. So expect that that might be different by the time your student is getting their direct loans. A student for freshman year can borrow $5,500. It goes up each year after that: $6,500 for sophomores and $7,500 for juniors and seniors. Payment typically starts 6 months after they leave school or drop below half-time status. The loan origination fee is a little over 1%. So that means if you have the $5,500, know that the full $5,500 is not being applied towards your student's bill, because they do take out that origination fee. As I mentioned earlier, around June-ish, they would need to complete entrance counseling and sign a master promissory note after they commit to their college, and that has to be done before the loans are dispersed. And this is completed using their Fsa Id and going to the studentaid.gov site. Okay. If the student is going to take out a private loan, if additional funds are needed after the direct loans, they would go to a private bank, These types of loans with private banks are not found on financial aid award letters. The student would have to undergo a comprehensive credit check and will need to most likely have a credit-worthy cosigner to get these private loans. Interest rates can vary greatly and depends on the borrower's creditworthiness. In Ohio, the variable interest rate can go up as high as 23%. Loan terms can vary widely by the lender, and payments can be deferred while the student's enrolled in college, and typically there's no origination fees. Some banks will offer a cosigner release once the student makes a certain number of on-time payments. This is important to research these options. There can also be loans taken out in the parent's name, which happen by completing the FAFSA. And this is a loan that is in the parent's name on behalf of the student. So as I mentioned, the FAFSA is the first step in being able to obtain a Parent Plus loan. Parent has a simplified credit check that does not include a debt-to-income ratio or a FICO score. If approved, the parent can borrow up to the total cost of attendance minus any aid awarded to their students. Payments can be deferred while the student's in school. For the 22-23 school year, this loan is fixed at 7.54% interest. There's an origination fee also with this kind of loan, and it's just over 4.2%. Rates for interest and fees reset on July 1st for the 23-24 award year. If a parent happens to be denied the PLUS loan due to an adverse credit history, the student becomes eligible to get unsubsidized direct loans, so an additional $4,000 for freshmen or sophomores. Parents can also look into taking out private loans that are similar to the Parent Plus loans. With the parent private loans, the parent borrows money in their name on behalf of the student after completing a private loan application process and a credit check. This you usually do about 60 to 90 days before the school semester starts. So a few things, as I mentioned earlier, I was asking if there were any junior parents in the audience, but this holds true for you. Just know that after this 23-24 FAFSA year, they're anticipating changes to the FAFSA form. So things are going to look a little bit differently when you go to do this when you're looking at your student's sophomore year in college. So that's just a little bit of a heads up on that. Another thing that I didn't mention is that the FAFSA form opens October 1st. My recommendation would be that you might not want to go on that particular site that first week in October. It tends to have a few glitches. They're also talking about having the new applications for federal loan forgiveness early October. I don't know the date for that, but know that that site may have a lot of traffic. You might want to just wait until about October 10th. If you're on the site and are getting a number of error messages, my recommendation would be to go back to it at a later time, either later that day or another day, because the wheels might be spinning there for a bit. Okay, so this concludes our financial aid presentation. As I mentioned, I'm happy to answer general questions for the audience, and I'll stay after a little bit if you have something more specific to you. If you want your student to see us sooner rather than later, I'd encourage them to sign up. We have a sign-up form on our door, or as I mentioned, to reach out via email. Okay, so any questions? Back that way. Okay, so if The question was, what is the student seeing? So if you're sort of worried about your own privacy, what I recommend doing is you can get the FAFSA started. The first few pages essentially are demographic information, and then they ask for parent information. If you're able to transfer your IRS data, those values are not displayed on the FAFSA. It's kind of grayed out and it says transferred by IRS. But they are able to see, depending on how much they notice, your income data. But at the end, they do their own data. Okay, other questions right here? Okay. Okay, I'm really glad you asked that question because there's a slight thing I forgot to mention. Okay, so the question was they have a current senior, current junior. So you would do what's easiest. So if any of you happen to have older siblings that are in college currently, and this would hold true for you next year, you want to do your oldest student first and if you go in as the parent and do the older one, that second year you do it, a lot of your information is already going to be populated in there, so you don't have to repeat all the demographic information, but it'll hopefully give you a link that says, is there another FAFSA you want to do? And then that way you can do the other one. Yes, but again, sometimes there's a few glitches, but that's usually how it's supposed to work. Oh, another thing with the IRS data retrieval tool, you want to be able to match your address exactly as it appears on your tax return form. So for example, if your tax preparer made an error with your street name and spelled it incorrectly, when you go to do that IRS data retrieval tool, you too are going to spell it incorrectly. If they use street, ST, period, you're going to use ST, period. If they spelled it out, you're spelling it out. The address has to match exactly your tax return form. Other questions? Yes, right there. Yes, you have to redo it every year. So again, that FAFSA needs to be completed each year for your college student. And then so for the 23-24 school year, you're looking at 2021 W-2s and tax returns. And for parents that come to us for help with the FAFSA, sometimes they'll come with only their tax return. We need to see both because, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing if there's been any contributions to retirement accounts, and that's reflected on the W-2. That also reminds me of another thing. If you are looking for help with your FAFSA, we will be having FAFSA filing nights here at Mentor High. There will be 2 of us advisors circling around the room to provide help. We know a few little tips and tricks to make things just slightly faster. So that, again, is on the 12th and the 18th. Sign-ups are out there now on that PTC FAFSA. And then we're also available for individual appointments, too. You can reach out to either Mrs. Cesar or myself, and we'd be happy to see you during school hours on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. Other questions? Over here in the orange. Yeah.
I was wondering the work study.
Yes.
What if we're not sure? Should we mark it?
I would say mark it. You have nothing to lose because you don't, even if you don't qualify for it, no harm, no foul. I would either answer that question, yes, you're interested, or not sure. I wouldn't do a flat out no. Yeah. And again, if the student's not interested, that's okay. They don't have to accept that. When you get your whole package, you have that ability to accept and decline loans, to accept work study, or decline it if you're eligible. And then right behind you, there was a question. Mm-hmm. Okay, so with scholarships, for example. So grant money, the FAFSA is going to give colleges a fixed, your financial information, whether you're eligible for any, and that can really vary. So for example, a private school such as, John Carroll, they have certain grant money, like the blah, blah, blah grant money. So that's, by doing the FAFSA, there's nothing extra that you need to do for that. For scholarships, it sees what you might be eligible for that particular institution. And all those institutions will vary. That's why those financial aid award letters are so important to see what comes back. Certain schools get better aid than other schools. Now scholarships, those have a wide variety of criteria. It might be, my daughter, for example, she's Polish. She found a scholarship because she's Polish, and we're not all that Polish. But she met that criteria, did an essay, met the deadline, and was awarded that particular scholarship. So there, with scholarships, there are a couple different ways that they might be awarded. If a student is accepted to a college and they have merit money that could be based on a wide variety of factors, you might not even have any idea as to how they awarded that. They'll say, congrats, you got accepted, here's this $5,000 renewable scholarship. In addition to that, they might have a tab where you can go in and see what kind of scholarships are available to incoming freshmen based on a wide variety of criteria. And in addition to that, local scholarships, here they should be searching. They have things based on where they went to middle school or maybe elementary school, and wide variety of criteria, not all based on need or grade point. There are scholarships out there for a lot of different things. Not the scholarship aspect. Okay, that can be a whole separate application. So that's not related to the scholarship per se, other than merit aid that would come from that school. It's a good idea if so for example, Ohio State. They want to, if that's on their list, November 1st is their early decision deadline, or early action, and they would want to investigate their scholarships. So there's something called a moral scholarship that is part of their Common App. So they'd want to do that for their top choice schools to see what the criteria is with the different scholarships. But they have time for some of that, like a Bowling Green or a Kent. They're going to have other incoming scholarships that they would have time with, but they should be investigating those. John Carroll, I'm just using that as another example. They'll give out so much in merit aid, and then they might say, hey, we also think you'd be a good candidate for the ABC scholarship and the XYZ scholarship, and that's an additional application, and they encourage that student to apply for those. So they all handle that a little bit differently. Any other questions? Yes. And then I thought maybe, did I see a question behind there? No. Okay. Yeah.
So I feel like he's missing some presentations that are done here at the high school.
Yeah.
During English class.
Right. Yes, recommend, because with the remote day tomorrow, actually my agenda for tomorrow is I'll send out emails to all the full-time CCP students so they have my contact information so that they can reach out. So I had a student reach out to me early on, and we even met virtually. He was sitting at Lakeland on an Adirondack chair and on a bright sunny day, and we discussed all this. But yes, definitely we're here for them. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, yes. So the current asset values are as of the date you file the FAFSA. And again, you want to have a pretty good idea of what those values are, that if you would be selected for verification, that you kind of have backup. Okay, any other questions? Over here. Okay, probably in a minute.
So a lot of the schools we visited said that the deadline is December 1st.
It's nice. My motto is sooner is better than later, just in terms of stress level for the students too. It's a lot. You know, they've got a lot going on. And once they get their college applications and everything in, then they can start looking at scholarships. And I tell them to look at that as a part-time job, because scholarship money is great, great money. And so if they get their application done and over with, then that's one less stress. It's a very stressful year for them. And they should have their list of schools for when you go to do the FAFSA. It'll take those 10 schools, but you can always add more once it's processed. But you also, too, don't want them to go overboard with applying to a bazillion schools. I had a student last year, I think she applied to 17 schools, and some of them she had no intention of going to or even considering. Every time I saw her, she was stressed. You want to cast a wide net, and you want options. My own children, I made sure that they had a wide net, and you want, the counselors always talk about having your reach schools, target schools, and safety schools, and I also recommend that in terms of finances too, so you have options. I always liked kids to have something a little closer to home in case, depending on what comes back, and they maybe need to pivot and commute, that is an option for them too. And our LEAF offices are housed in Lakeland, so we help Lakeland students with their FAFSAs. So speaking of stress, we'll have kids that are doing their FAFSAs. We had them for the beginning of fall semester. We were 3 weeks into the semester and they're working on their FAFSAs. You know, that's a little late. So ideally, that FAFSA piece, as your student is working on their college applications, in October you can be working on gathering up your financial information, getting that FAFSA started, and then they could come in at the tail end and do their personal information. And I highly recommend, again, that they are the ones to create their Fsa Id, and they should be the ones to sign their FAFSA. That is their signature, and this is a loan that they potentially are taking out in their name, so they should be aware of the process, in my opinion. Any other general questions? Yes? Okay, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Mm-hmm. Yes, it does. So if it's you as the parent, then it gets reported as a parental asset. If it's someone other than a parent, say a grandparent or aunt and uncle, it is not reported on the student's FAFSA. Yeah, okay, we'll talk about that. Mm-hmm. Any other general questions? All right, so I'll be here in the front for your individual questions. And thank you for coming. Tell your students